of our 4 training sessions on the timely topic of engaging volunteers in a world that has changed forever. So as I mentioned before, my name is Nathalie Lafrenière, and I'm the Regional Director of the CSS Regional Resources for the CCSN. And I'm happy to introduce Laurie Gottlieb of the Gottlieb Consulting joining us today for the second of a 4-part session dedicated to volunteer management. I'll let Laurie introduce herself in just a moment. So before we get to that, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. So today we are meeting on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. We honor the land and the peoples of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe, whose ancestors have lived on this territory since time immemorial, and whose culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. We honor all First Nations, Inuits, and Métis people, their elders, their ancestors, and their valuable past and present contribution to this land. Miigwech. So welcome to Engage series, where we offer professional development opportunities to build capacity within organizations and the sector. Our sessions will be recorded and shared on our online knowledge hub for CSS member organization. So please visit our communityhomesupport.ca/members website to discover documents, reports, and resources to help your organization make informed decisions and enhance programs and practices in community support services. So I hand it over to you, Laurie. Have a great session.
Thank you. Thanks, Annalie. Thanks, everybody. I don't know who was on the first session, so I'll give you a little bit of blurb about myself for the session. So little information. I've been in the field of volunteer management for more than 30 years, ran programs. I'm based out of Toronto, ran programs both local, provincial, national. My whole career has actually been in volunteer management. As I was growing in the field, I've noticed lots of things, mainly how things have not changed. In some cases have gone backwards. And so I started to write articles. Those articles turned into workshops. Those workshops turned into training opportunities. And then about 8 years ago, I took over. I actually reached out to Humber College and told them that the program was not really reflective as to what was going on. I use different words, but I'll be polite because we're being recorded. And they said, yeah, they know. And I rebuilt the program and I taught it for 7 years until COVID kicked in and kind of sunsetted the program. Ever since then, I have been working on my own. So I consider myself a consultant by trade because I work by myself, but I go into organizations and I help them do anything related to volunteer engagement, volunteer management, from building programs to doing assessments to developing policies and procedures. I work with boards, committees, associations as well. The other side of my hat, my kind of retirement plan, is I also work for Elections Canada, was a federal returning officer for 3 elections, and now I'm what they call a field liaison officer and support 10 ridings in Toronto. So a couple of my housekeeping things. You can see on the slide that I have my website and I have my podcast. So I attempted a podcast. There's 8 sessions in there. They're 10, 15-minute micro educations, quick learning tips and tools. And my website has a lot of articles, templates, tools, resources that are available to you. As well, feel free to reach out. There's only so much I can do in the hour with that extra half hour. So I believe in helping out. I believe in giving back. So if you have questions afterwards or you want to do it more privately or whatever the situation is, feel free to email me anytime. As well, I do have in this particular workshop, a pretty significant power deck. I may or may not follow the slides completely. I use them as a tool. I try not to talk to the slides. I try to talk to you. I'm basically talking to myself, but try and talk to you. And so, when you do the evaluation, it's like, didn't follow the slides. I'm okay with that. So So to not use up too much more time about myself, let's get started. So the first session we had was really all about emerging trends in the new normal. This one is a little bit more operational. So, I named it, risk management, what keeps you up at night. And it's interesting because there's a lot going on right now that has even come out of COVID and technology, and now AI, which is a world that we don't know, that has a humongous amount of potential to it, but also brings with it risks. So that's part of this workshop is going to be talking about that. Part of it's going to be talking about operational risks, things that you need to have, why you need to have them. So basically, we understand risk management as the process, the procedures that an organization has to do to protect themselves, their clients, the volunteers, the staff. And it's not a one-time only thing. It has to be an ongoing process. So, for example, you need to be looking at your onboarding packages annually and making sure that you are responding to the changes in your organization. You need to be reviewing your policies on an annual basis. How many of you have looked at your policies over the last year and revised them, updated them? I'll give you an example. There's one organization that I'm just working with right now who's removing all of the gender specific names, words, and policies. So because people don't want to see that. So like sometimes it's just little things, sometimes it's big things like, now that we're moving into a virtual world, do your policies reflect virtual? And we're going to talk about all these topics. So there's a lot to get over the next hour. So you have to consider what's at risk. So, you're sitting back, big picture thinking. You have some serious risks, especially in your organizations. You're working with seniors, you're working in the community, your volunteers are off-site. They are driving people, they're visiting people, they're serving meals. There's all kinds of things that they're doing where you don't actually get to see them do it. So the areas of risk are things like, obviously physical contact, confidentiality, high personal involvement. Like I'll give you an example of, I had a volunteer in one of the organizations that I work with that formed a relationship with one of the clients, and the client ended up in the hospital, and the volunteer started to go visit the client without our knowledge in the hospital. And from one perspective, you're going, that's really nice. What a sweet thing to do. But there's risk to that because the volunteer is now crossing into this gray zone of friendship. So, one of the things we had to deal with, and we actually had to tell the volunteer that they really couldn't visit anymore, was what if the client asks the volunteer an opinion? Should I take this treatment or that treatment? It puts everybody in a very difficult position. So we don't realize what can happen and how things can go very quickly from one thing to another. Direct contact with vulnerable populations, minimal supervision, even mentorship can be an area of risk. So if you have one volunteer mentoring another volunteer, again, it's very quick to go into the gray zone. So things that we need to consider. Trends in risk management. So what do I mean by that? Well, there are things that are happening now that we didn't have to deal with 10 years ago. So examples being technology. So you have your volunteers that are potentially applying online. So their information is going into databases, through your website. B, volunteering online. So virtual volunteering, doing training online, access to information, things such as, and I've had, these are true examples, or I had a volunteer that took the logo of the organization, copied it, pasted it to their own personal email, and represented themselves as a member of the organization without our knowledge. Just technology in itself, everything can be hacked. So things that we need to consider. Social media. This is an area that's going to grow because the upside of social media is that we can reach more people. So when we do the next session on the marketing, we're going to talk about social media. But the risks inherent with social media are that you lose control. So we see it now. You go on your Instagram and you're seeing all kinds of stuff that it's just voices out there forming their personal opinion. So we have to look at what the risks are. What can a volunteer say and not say on social media? What is representative of the organization, what is not. So it is an inherent risk that we are now getting into. And as we move into the world of AI, it's going to get even more complicated when it comes to social media. The pandemic alone, and what does that future look like? So are we going to move back into a virtual world? Our organization is going to get shut down again. So these are risks that we have to look at and we have to consider within our policies, how we do business, how we screen our volunteers, and how do we retain our volunteers. And the other big one, I think every people are inherently good and they want to help, but there are also those that have ulterior motives. So again, now that we're moving more on to the technological side of things, we have to be very careful as to what we do, what we train, what our policies are. And in some cases, all you can do is build the policy, put in the handbook, hope for the best, and then have a process when you have to deal with it. So lots of things to think about. Again, the risk management cycle follows the volunteer management cycle. So what is the risk in planning? What is the risk in role design? What is the risk in marketing? So we're going to go through that today. But when you go back to your, after the session, think about where do you see risk? And then how are we going to minimize it? So you look at risk from 3 different lenses. Is it low? Is it medium? Is it high? So low risk, obviously are things that we're not overly concerned about. There are things we can put into place, but they're not going to put the organization, the clients, the volunteers, the members at high risk. High risk are things where, we start doing more in screening, training, retention, education, and in some cases, we don't actually do something because the risk is too high. I've given you in the handouts a risk management life cycle. So basically, the process is we have to identify the risk. So there's an evaluation phase, there's a resolution phase, and then there's a verification or a clarification phase, right? So we identify what the risk is, we do the analysis, and then we make a decision. Do we manage this risk or do we go, no, we're not doing this? And then if we decide to manage it, what do we have to put in place? So what is our risk response planning? So example, do we have to add a training? Do we have to build a new policy? Do we have to do a role description modification? Right, and then we execute, and then we ensure we do an evaluation to make sure that this is acceptable, and then we can close the risk. So part of closing the risk are things like after something has happened, we make sure that our policy is updated, we make sure that our training is updated, we make sure that we ask the appropriate question when we're doing interviewing or screening. So I'll give you a true life example again on my side. Organization I was working for they were doing a special event, and to attract participants, they decided that they wanted to have a children's area. So they came to me and said, we want you to volunteer, like to create a volunteer-led children's area. And so I went through this process and I went, no. And so they went, what do you mean no? And I said, we're dealing with one-off volunteers. So we have not put the process into play in terms of doing vulnerable reference checks. There's nobody to manage them. So they're going to be self-managed because everybody else can be doing everything, doing all kinds of things. What are the laws and the expectation as to how many children per adult? What happens if we lose a child? What happens if a child gets hurt? What happens if a volunteer is physical with a child? Are you willing to manage all those risks? And they thought about it and they went, nope. And therefore we rejected it. So that's the kind of thinking. The intention is positive and wonderful, but the reality is I wasn't prepared to put my reputation, my job, and the organization's reputation on the line for something that's a nice to have. So it didn't happen. But that's the kind of thing that we have to think about it. right? So why do we need risk management? Well, obviously, the more complex life goes, the more complex our services are, the more we have to consider that's risky. And it's a part of our job we don't like to do because we always think about the positive. And honestly, there are very few legal suits that have gone through, but there are a few that have. Usually it's related to discrimination, is the ones that I've heard. But you don't want to be in that situation that somebody, volunteers, decides to sue you for whatever it is. And people sue now. They're just, it's so, the world has changed, right? And so you don't want to ever get caught in that situation. But if something does happen, you've got to have your ducks in a row. And it all comes down to the role description and your policies and procedures and your training, right? We have a duty of care, and we're in a society that everything moves very quickly. We all see, considering what's going on in this world, how quick things get public, and just move from from one area to another area. We don't want negativity to grow traction. So we need to make sure that we have as much risk management in place without becoming too risk focused. Okay. So you're looking at, like I said before, assessing, evaluating, managing, and then measuring. Was the risk, evaluate, did what happened become what you wanted to happen? Okay. So the process is simple. We identify, we categorize the seriousness. So you develop a risk matrix. So what you can do is you take the role description, you break it down into activities, right? The responsibilities. And there's lots of templates out there, but you measure those. So, so you have a role, it's, delivering Meals on Wheels. So what are the risks in that? So things like, driving, communication, physical, tripping up the stairs, those types of things. You categorize those. What is the likelihood of this happening? And then you have to manage those risks. So what are you going to put in place to ensure that those risks don't happen? So there are these risk matrix templates that you can use that help you basically do a objective grid. And it's a good way to look at these role descriptions and break them down. Okay. The approach that you use has got to be consistent though. So you can't go in one area, I'm going to look at risk, and in another area, I'm not. So that's number one. You have to have a process. So like I said to you at the beginning, you have to look at every year, we're going to look at the role descriptions. And not just you. Get your program managers to look at it. Get volunteers to look at it. Is it reflecting what the volunteers are actually doing? Is there anything missing in there that we need to put in there? You have to be the ability to monitor things. So if you're going to review things like policies, like even as simple as putting a review date so that it's a reminder that you did it last year, you have to do it this year. But I question, it's a question I ask you and take it back. I'm just doing this with another organization, is when was the last time you reviewed your volunteer policies? So like I did with the last session, here's the takeaway. Go back and look at your volunteer policies. And once you've looked at your volunteer policies, look at your handbooks or your orientation packages and make sure, because you may have made changes into your policies, but you didn't do them in your handbooks. I've seen organizations do that, and or vice versa. You update your handbook, but you don't update your policy, right? So, and then once you do these things, especially policies, you need to communicate them. Policies are not meant to be sitting on your shelf in a binder where nobody knows they exist, right? So we create policies, we put them together, and then we house them. And then we take a piece of those policies, maybe it's a paragraph or so, and we build those into the handbook. And then we make the assumption that the volunteers understand that. And 90% of the time, they don't even know that there's policies attached to that. So you don't have to send your volunteers all the policies. I'm not saying do that, but they need to know that they're available to them to look at. And the same thing with your staff and the same thing with your clients. Why do we have to do it? Well, obviously, legislation, in some cases, AODA, Human Rights Code, there are things that we need to have in place to ensure that we're being fair and equitable, especially now where diversity, inclusion, equity are a big trigger for a lot of people. So you want to make sure that you are being diverse, equitable, and as inclusive as possible, even in the scheme of having things like accessibility policies, so that you have a policy ensuring that all volunteers have, the ability to have accessible devices, maybe support people, things like that. So you have to look that, kind of figure that out. Demographics, you need to know what the numbers are. For personnel, like I said, if you don't have things like, if you ended up going to court, if a volunteer sued you, the first thing the judge is going to ask is, did they have a role description and was it up to date, and were there policies? So you want to make sure, that's why I keep saying to you through this whole session, that you have role descriptions that are reflective of the roles, and they're not everything but the kitchen sink, and they're not so gray that there's a lot of room for that gray zone, right? Certification, security, these are all really important parts of risk management. And another, education is really important. Part of that whole risk management component is ensuring that your volunteers have the appropriate training and education so that they can do their roles and understand where they fit into the organization. So I get this question a lot about policies versus handbooks. They are two separate things. Your volunteer handbook is not your policy, and your policy and procedure manual is not your handbook. Handbooks are set up to be guidebooks, right? They're usually, the language is easier to understand. The steps are there. It's more of a narrative, right? But it does have what you can and cannot do. It will have volunteers' responsibilities, have organizations' responsibilities. Everybody has different handbooks, but does not take the place of your policies. Your policies, and I'll give you a slide on that, are the do's and don'ts. They are the black and whites. They are the procedures. They are the statements. And they usually have a different format attached to them. So don't confuse the two. They're not one and the same. And I'm going to get questions on that later. Couple of big words here. So vicarious liability. Ultimately, employers are responsible for accidents, crimes committed by their employees and volunteers, especially if they've known about it. So ultimately, if an employer knows that something has happened or could happen, or has put a volunteer in a dangerous position, or somebody's unqualified, they can be seen as being liable. Doesn't mean they're going to, but that's one legal term that kind of sits as an overall umbrella. The other is duty of care. We have to, by law, do everything reasonable to deliver programs in a safe manner and ensure that our volunteers have access to information that is relevant to what they're doing. So we have a duty of care. I am not a lawyer. I'm not going to try and be a lawyer or get into the legal wording of things. But for example, under duty of care, there are certain stipulations. So one that has come to mind for me a few times is accessibility. If you work in an old building and you have a volunteer that says, well, you need to, upgrade this, and you don't have financially, you can't do what has to be done permanently. You do have a duty of care to try and come up with an alternate. But if you cannot do it, then I think the law says, like I said, there's this reasonable expectation, but not to the point of due hardship. Okay. We have a duty of care to our clients and our volunteers. So I'll give you another example. I had a volunteer who had epilepsy, and she worked with two other volunteers. They did a knitting group, and they were down in a room in the basement of the organization, and everything was fine. In the summertime, the other two volunteers take a break. Now, this particular volunteer had given me a letter when she first started out explaining what happens if she goes into a seizure. So one of the things was she cannot be left alone, right? And then the process if she has a seizure. So summer comes, the two volunteers are going to take a break. And then I had to have this difficult conversation with the one volunteer who has epilepsy, saying, you can't be left in the basement by yourself. And she says, well, of course I can. I have no problems doing that. And I said, but you can't. You actually gave me a letter explaining to me very clearly that you can't be left alone. And she said, well, I have no problem, so everything's fine. And I went, but I have a duty of care here. So you can continue doing the knitting, do it from home. You can use the common area when it's free. It's not always free, but if it's free, you're welcome to do that because there are people around you. She wasn't happy with that. She went to the Epilepsy Association and lodged a complaint. The Epilepsy Association contacted us, explained that we were being discriminatory. I then, in this process, which is a very ugly process and does not make us feel good as leaders of volunteers, explained the process that she had given us, including the letter, which she did not inform the Epilepsy Association that she had given to us. At that point, they said, oh, okay, we weren't aware of that. So because the volunteer had left these instructions, it helped us, right? So we did everything we could to try and accommodate while ensuring that she was safe, the clients were safe, the staff were safe, the building was safe. So that's what I'm saying. We have to, it's not black and white risk management, especially when it comes to volunteers. So just something to consider, okay? And you're not in it alone. So we don't do this by ourselves. We have a responsibility, and our responsibility really does sit in that role description on. So when a program manager says, I want a volunteer to do ABC, part of our hat, remember I said to you last time, we're octopuses, right? We have all different arms. Part of that story is also looking at it from the lens of risk. So we have to look at the risks. We have to do exactly kind of what I said a few minutes ago. We have to have those conversations with the program managers who may say, we need volunteers to do this. We don't have the staff to do it. It's a great role for volunteers, and maybe it is. But then we have to look at, what is the risk? Is it low, medium, high? Can we manage the risk? Can the direct supervisor manage the risk? Is it something that they're willing to take on? Is management willing to take it on? So remember, you don't do this alone. And these are those cases where you start going, I can't make this decision. I need to go above, because you never want to be caught, as the scapegoat. So when you have certain situations that go on, like the example I told you about the woman who was knitting, I went to my boss and said, this is what I think we should be doing, but I'm not prepared to make this decision alone. So risk is a group effort, including volunteers. They have a responsibility as well. Part of it is following the role description, adhering to policies and procedures, understanding what they're signing off on when it comes to confidentiality, when it comes to privacy. These are things that are very commonly broken. For them to tell us when things are going on. So an example is a driver who has had multiple accidents. Again, true story. I had a driver who multiple accidents. One of the other volunteers told me. So what am I supposed to do with this information? Right? It's hearsay. But it forced me I couldn't ignore it, even though it was coming from another volunteer. So I had to call this volunteer in and have that conversation. And the situation was, well, it's never happened while I'm driving a client. Okay, but that doesn't matter. It could happen. So here again is my due diligence, my duty of care. I can't take that chance. And so I had to remove that driver which was not a pleasant situation, but who am I responsible to, right? So I offered up the volunteer a whole bunch of other things to do, and eventually we worked it out and they did it. But sometimes, especially as our volunteer corps is aging, it's going to be more and more of a problem. When people's cognitive and physical abilities start to affect their life, we're the last people to know about it. Okay, so again, something we have to consider, and every one of these situations is a one-off, but you can put things in policy that if volunteers have had, multiple accidents, they have to let us know. Ensuring that a volunteer is in physical ability to lift X amount of pounds. There are things we can put in place. So documenting is really important. Sorry, just swallowed a piece of ice. What do you archive? You have to understand, everything you write about a volunteer is public information for the volunteer to have. So you have to be very careful what you put in. So the application forms, any document. So if you're going to write things, let's say if you're doing progressive dismissal or things like that with a volunteer, just ensure that what is going in there is something that they're able to see. So we're looking at, what are we archiving? Application forms, certificates, certifications, diplomas, medical information, reference checks, driver's transcripts, criminal reference checks, evaluations, reviews. So you should be keeping those in file. And I know you're going to ask this question, how long do you keep them for? If you have the space, I tend to run on the 7-year HR time frame, if you can do it. If not, then you can do a kind of like a abridged version of things. But we want these things because we want to ensure that if a volunteer comes back, you're no longer there, that there's a history. There are volunteers that kind of move from organization to organization to organization. So having those files is really, really important. But, you can't put things like, this volunteer is driving me insane. Like, that stuff you can't put in there. I used to kind of code things. So I understood it, but nobody else understood it. But you have to be very careful as to what you put in there, because I have had volunteers ask for the records. I've also had volunteers. So I had a volunteer once who came for an interview and proceeded to be politically incorrect, religiously incorrect, the whole bit. And so I said, yeah, no, you can't volunteer here. There are many reasons why. And I kind of explained, what the process is, what the volunteer program's like, that what they were trying to do was not reflective of what we're looking for the volunteer. Okay, fine. 4 years later, I'm at another, it was 5 years later, I'm at another organization, and guess who walks in the door? And I said, remember me? So it's just the history of people. There are volunteers that do things that, we just want to make sure that we have records of it. And we deal with a lot of stuff that's in the gray zone. So it's not easy, because I say a lot of the issues that we deal with are related to boundaries, right? And so we have inappropriate behavior, we have appropriate behavior, and then we have the gray zone. So what are things in the gray zone? Dealt with things like behavior falls under the gray zone, because sometimes it's considered the perception of whoever it is that's getting it. Hygiene, the gray zone. I don't know if you guys I've had to do it, have that conversation with a volunteer about scent. Inappropriate communications with other volunteers. So there are lots of things that fall in the gray zone. So we have to look at, whatever decisions, whatever actions we make, that it's the organization, the client's best interest, and obviously for the volunteers. But I think, if I have to be perfectly honest, it's the client and the organization's best interest. And sometimes volunteers start in one place and end up somewhere else. So an example of that is, I had a volunteer presenter who was scripted presentations, was doing great. But the more he did these presentations, the more comfortable he became doing these presentations, the more he went off script. And so I would do these little check-ins every few months, never tell them when I was going to a presentation. And I walked into a presentation and I don't know, he wasn't even on script. He had gotten to the point where he was talking more about his opinion, like, no, don't take that medication. I tried that, it doesn't work. Like, he was so off script, so inappropriate, so beyond the boundaries that I had to rein him back in and retrain him and, kind of give him a 1, 2, 3 year out kind of scenario. So we deal with a lot of boundaries that we have to look at the actual behavior, not the person, and how do we address the behavior. So what are the tools that we can use? So we have a lot of tools. We have our policies and procedures. We have our screening process, which is really important. It's not a one size fits all. We have training. We have liability insurance. We have position descriptions. We have supervision. We have a strong business plan or operational plan of how we do what we do. We have waivers, consent forms, things that they sign. We have codes of conduct, codes of ethics, privacy statements, and we have guidelines, evaluations. So we have a lot of tools that we could be using, but we have to make sure we're using them, right? So we have policies, we have procedures, we have the records that we keep. These are all tools. So I wanted to talk about policies. So again, you're going to have this slide. They're just things that I want to pull out. So data policy approval, policy statement. So there's 4 or 5 different categories, and you can choose the way you want to do this. Policy statement is the statement. It's not the policy. It's the statement of policy. It's the rule. The purpose of the policy is why you're doing it. It's intended to do A, B, and C. So we have this policy to ensure that we are providing best customer service for our clients, ensuring that volunteer drivers are following, the rules of the road and appropriate communication conduct. The scope, some people use scope, some people don't. So who's covered under the policy? Employees and volunteers, students, everybody. And then the actual policy. Some people do add as well responsibility, so it falls under certain departments. And some people do add related policies. So actually on the policy, I've seen policies that are related, so kind of crossover, so that you've got the whole bucket. Okay. Position descriptions. To me, this is probably one of the most important tools you have in your tool belt related to risk. If your position description is not reflective of what the role is, then how do you expect the volunteer to follow the role? So you need to clarify the roles and the responsibilities, the requirements, as well as the benefits. I think the benefits are really important. But when you do the requirements, and I've seen a lot of role descriptions that are either vague enough that they don't make any sense, or they've got everything but the kitchen sink in there. You need to be specific if you can be specific. But I get why you put everything in there, but if you're going to do that, then the volunteer needs to understand what that means. Okay, so what are the requirements of the position? So driver's license, able to lift, specific skills. But when you go into those gray zone of skills, it gets a little unsure. Like I've seen skills, excellent communication skills. What does that mean? Right? Define excellent to you. For somebody where English is not a first language, is excellent able to read? I don't know. So just be wary when you're identifying skills, what you mean by those skills, and not kind of throw everything but the kitchen sink in there. Are there specific trainings or certifications? Fine. And then supervision, like who is the volunteer reporting to? Okay, what department is the volunteer reporting to? But ensure that you have these things. And I like the benefits of the position. So what's the value added? Because the volunteer position from your side is looking at the risk. But the volunteer position for the volunteer side is understanding the risk, but understanding why they're doing that volunteer role. So they have a different perception of the position description as you do. The position description from our end is accountability. That's what it is. It's not marketing. The marketing is different. Okay, so that description or whatever it is when we go to sell that volunteer position, which is the next workshop, that's different than the position description. Think about you. When you took your job, or any role that you've had, you want that position to reflect the role that you've got, not like, I got hired to do this, but I was doing all of this, right? So consider that when you're looking at the role descriptions. What's my time? I got 15 minutes. Okay, there's a lot in this one, that's why. I don't think I need to talk about this. The purpose of screening, so now we're looking at the screening side of things, is again, to minimize risk. So if we don't have a screening process in place, then we are accountable for what happens, right? It needs to be part of how we onboard volunteers. But we have to be careful about screening because I find that we don't always listen. So part of screening is certain things that that you're doing. The application form is part of screening. The any reference checks is part of screening. The interview is part of screening. Vulnerable checks are part of screening, but they're part of a package. So when you're interviewing, you need to listen more and talk less. When you're doing reference checks, you need to understand the source of reference checks. I know we do them and we have to do them, but I can also say from my perspective, who's going to give a bad reference? Nobody will these days. So you gotta weigh everything. Liability insurance is another, part of the screening and risk management, especially with the cars. I don't have, again, this is not something that I'm an expert in, but I'm assuming that you know what your liability insurance is from your organization. It was a minimum of $2 million. It may even be higher now. If there's going to be a lawsuit, so if a client is going to sue, they're going to sue the organization. They may sue the volunteer and the organization, but they don't see the difference. They're suing the organization. The volunteer did ABC, organization's getting sued. Okay. And then again, can't have the conversation here. There are some organizations that require drivers to have additional coverage. I know it's been an issue with insurance companies. I don't have an answer to that, to be perfectly honest. Every organization, every insurance company, I think, runs this differently. So what I do want to ensure, make sure you understand, is that the volunteers are good capability of driving, right? Cars are up to date, those types of things, but and have insurance, which I'm sure you guys are all doing all that. Okay, the application form. So whether the application form is being filled out online or on paper or whatever it is, make sure that you're asking enough questions and the right questions, and make sure that you have confidentiality statement in there and a privacy statement in there. Okay. The demographic stuff I don't need to get into. Reasons for volunteering, again, these are all screening tools. Some people ask more, but I'll tell you, like, there are things that I don't like, is like, they know nothing about the organization, and yet you're asking them to check off the 5 things they would like to do. So here you are kind of putting yourself at risk already, because they're going to say, well, I checked off that I want to be a friendly visitor. Why can't I be a friendly visitor? For me, it looks like it's an available position. And then you get stuck when you're going through this process of interviewing, where you realize 5 minutes into that interview, they are not an appropriate friendly visitor. So you have to kind of look at the application form as part of the screening, right? It's a little bit of marketing side of things, but to me, it really is your first step of screening. Reference checks, again, take them with a grain of salt. They are not and should not be the end-all reason for why you bring somebody on. It is a barrier for a lot of people. We all recognize it as a barrier, but it is a tool. So I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying that be aware of it doesn't carry the weight that it used to carry. But again, if there was an issue, you're going to be asked by the lawyer, did you do reference checks before you brought a volunteer on? And depending on the role, if it's a high-risk role, then you should have. If it's a minimal risk role, there's an argument to be said, it was an event. We're not reference checking everybody. So like I said, it's all about evaluating and unpacking the risks. Criminal reference checks, I'm not going to get into. We all do them for the vulnerable sector. There are regional differences. It has limitations. As you and I well know, it's only good as of the day that it's been done. So again, it's not the end all or be all. It's a component of minimizing risks. I do want to talk about interviews because I find over 30 years of interviewing volunteers, we get into a system where we go through a process, right? And it's a mutual screening. It allows the volunteer to screen you, but also for you to screen them. But we need to be able to spend more time listening. So it needs to be done. It's all related to protection and satisfaction and so forth. But we need to spend more time listening in interviews and less about just going through the perfunctory motions, because it's amazing what you hear. So they came in to do this, but as you're listening, you go, oh, wait a minute, they may be better doing this or a piece of this. So it's all about they're checking you out, you're checking them out, and that's the way it should be. You want to work the questions. So I'm a huge fan of open-ended questions, secondary questions, making notes, and listening. But we have to look at certain things. So I once had a volunteer who did not make eye contact, answered one-word answers for every question that I gave them, came off as completely unmotivated, and I didn't know what to do with that. And so I actually booked a second interview. The second interview, I kind of like set the framework. I ended up going from interviewing to kind of explain the organization more, saying, think about it, come back, let's have another conversation, but come back with questions when you come back. And the second interview was completely different. Culturally, there's so many things that people bring to the screening. Parents taught them not to be disrespectful. Culturally, they don't make eye contact. There's so much that people bring with them that we don't always know what we know. But again, we can't just make assumptions. But we also have to be prepared to say no to volunteers that we don't believe are qualified. Having an interview is not, filling out an application, having an interview is not a guarantee that you have a volunteer position. You control it. You can do whatever you want until they're placed. Once they're placed, then it becomes a little bit more difficult to get rid of them, right? Then we're dealing with things like progressive dismissal, performance management, those types of things. Prior to, you have the latitude to do what you think is right? So just consider that. Just looking at our time. I've given you methods of screening. I'm not going to discuss it. You have it. And it's okay to say no. Not many people say that. You can say no to people. You could be sensitive. You don't ignore it. If you're not sure about somebody, then tell them you think about it. There's no guarantee just because they fill an application form that a position's available. Say thank you, offer alternate jobs, or, the famous, we don't have anything right now, but we'll get back to you. And we pray to God that they don't come back to us. So that's tried and true. And we've done that 1,000 times, but don't ignore it. Like if somebody's reaching out to you, you interviewed them, there's something there, you're not going to place them. Don't ignore them, because not only are you not dealing with it, but you're also forcing the potential for you to get negative press out there, right? Where the volunteers, oh my God, I never heard from them again. Don't volunteer there. So, again, I'm giving you very generalized things for very specific stories. I could tell you stories for hours as to things that I've had to deal with volunteers, but I've had to tell volunteers that right now I don't have something. And yeah, I've had to white lie it a little bit. But I never left a volunteer without another option, checking another organization. And I've taken interviews and halfway through them and have called it. And so like, this is not going to happen. Let's talk about something else. Okay. Don't ignore the, Volunteer Canada has the 10 safe steps. So that's basically this. I've talked a lot about what's going on, but on their website, on Volunteer Canada's website, there is actually a document. There is a resource on a tool on the 10 safe steps. So if you don't know about that, I think it's free to download, and feel free to take a look at that. Okay. Performance management. So part of risk, the part we don't like, is managing people. Okay. But in certain roles, we need to look at setting the objectives, getting an opportunity for feedback, providing feedback. How does the volunteer know that they're doing a good job if you haven't told them that? It doesn't happen at a National Volunteer Week. It doesn't happen, in the thank you letter during the holiday season. We need to be able to address things and address them in a positive way, identify needs for development or improvement. You go back to the role description, those types of things. It is a way of getting feedback. Feedback is great for appreciation, for coaching, for evaluation. So huge fan of performance management. Performance feedback, annual feedback, call it whatever you want, but it's a way for you to check in and either reinforce positive behavior or address negative behavior and things that could be negative. I'm just a little wary of time right now, so some stuff to talk about. Burnout. So this is when you know that things are going wrong and you have to address. So signs of burnout are canceling shifts, negative or complaining, overreacting to simple problems, performance slipping. This is where performance management or the conversation has to happen. Without this conversation, then it's just going to fall apart. So part of our risk management responsibility is to ensure that negative behavior issues are addressed. And this is becoming more and more. Volunteers need vacations. They're getting tired. They're over volunteered. They don't feel like they're being supported. And those are things that put volunteers and the clients at risk because the volunteers are not on their game. They're not giving you 100% and they're not listening to things. So volunteer burnout is a very real thing that we need to address. So avoiding burnout are things like connecting to purpose, giving them the opportunity to take a holiday, and keeping lines of communication open. So do a check-in every 3 months. And you're going to go, I don't have time to do this, or I can't do it. What a great role for a volunteer. So you could have a volunteer ambassador that checks in with other volunteers. So just ensuring that you're doing things that help, that keep things manageable. Looking at the position descriptions, maybe it's just too much. Maybe you need to break it down. Maybe the expectations are too high for the position. So things to consider. And then if we get into, kind of that personality stuff, he said, she said, all that kind of stuff, then you're going to get into dealing with difficult volunteers, right? And again, that's where that position description comes in. And it's about the observations of the behavior. We keep the emotion out of it. Right? You need to look at the behavior. This is what I saw happening, or this is what I was told was happening. Can we discuss it? What happened? And stop talking. Listening is a real big key here. And then indicate, well, we want to make sure that it's a positive experience for you, for the client, for us. This is what the next steps are going to be. Okay? And then you document. It's really important to document things. Okay. If you have to let a volunteer go, this is where policies and procedures come in. There should be a policy on letting volunteers go. There should be a policy of when volunteers are exiting the organization. I don't think a lot of organizations have it. Some do, some don't. This is where your policies come into place. You would step it up. So I follow the same theory as staffing, right? Verbal, written, research, final. So I always give volunteers the benefit of the doubt, but if I find something's going on, then they're going to get a notice. Does it hold weight legally? No, but it just ensures that we give them a break. And I'm not talking about situations where volunteers have done something that are illegal, unethical, like fire a volunteer, let them go, document. But if it's behavioral, sometimes, like I said, that guy that was doing presentations for me, sometimes it's a matter of changing the behavior, not always the case. But I think we've all had to let volunteers go. It's not pretty. It's not what we're raised to do, but we got to do what we got to do. But we've got to have the policies. Without the policies on it, then if they fight back, then you're, well, no, we don't have a procedure in doing this. So I would look at a policy on letting volunteers go. Okay. And then also as part of risk management is always evaluating, right? Looking at what does our program look like? Getting buy-in from stakeholders, educating people about our volunteer program, what our expectations are, how we manage risk, all those types of things, right? And when you're evaluating, you're looking at the volunteer evaluation. So again, part of risk management is evaluating volunteers, giving them an opportunity to provide feedback, do a survey, self-evaluate, and giving you an opportunity to celebrate their behavior, let them know what things, what's good, what's not so good. But then also the other side we have to look at is evaluating the program. So is what we're doing working? Quantitative, like we interviewed 100 volunteers, but we only placed 10. There's a problem there, right? So looking at the actual process, our own processes and our own, qualitative measures, like what's the satisfaction rate of volunteers in terms of support? What's the satisfaction rate of volunteers in terms of policy, role descriptions reflecting the role they're actually doing? So there's lots of things you can evaluate. And it's part of the risk management because that's where you find things that you need to improve, change, adapt, pivot, or just add new, right? So we're always looking at not just the actual volunteers themselves, but the volunteer program. What is the risk of the volunteer program? So it gave you a couple of tools on this. I'm not going to discuss it. It's kind of what I talked about. But at the end of the day, because I'm just aware of time, create timelines to do this work. Set realistic goals. So, I'm going to this year, the next 6 months, I'm going to review my role descriptions. Make it manageable. I know risk is not, we're busy with a lot of things and risk is not an area we love to do, but it's really important that we do that. And the other thing is, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of organizations that will share. There's no hidden secret here. This is not secret sauce, right? A policy is a policy. People will share policies. There's also a lot of stuff online where you can take a look at examples of policies, examples of role descriptions. We don't need to start from scratch, right? And the other thing is involve stakeholders and engage volunteers and connect to each other. So you can, as a group, decide, I've got some great policies and procedures, and you have a knowledge center. Upload that to the knowledge center so we can all learn from each other. The same thing with examples of role descriptions. The beauty of these associations of like-minded organizations that have similar roles is that you should share so that nobody has to reinvent the wheel or do things from scratch when there's already stuff available to them. Okay. So my final thoughts are what one has to do usually can be done. So we can do this. We can build the risk management and we can do it together. So we are at 2:30. I'm so impressed. I did that in the whole hour. And now we can open it up. Thank thank you all very much.